You know what I love? I love being live. And I love that there are already two people. Jay Patel, I love seeing you. You know, I love it even more when I get to actually look at you in the face. Thank you for the card today. That was absolutely splendid to actually receive. Wonderful. Thank you. So, I am thrilled today. I have my classroom here for one last beautiful time. Ooh, sorry. Fantastic. Sorry. I have just had one of the most beautiful days in regards to being able to catch glimpses of so many of my recent graduates from 5th grade. Today is our last day of school, and I have had the graced opportunity to say in everybody's eyes how much I love them, and it's just been such a good experience. Oh my gosh. Hello, Jay Patel. Hello, Mag. It is good to see you. I'm honored to see you. I sure hope that everybody's here. I hope everybody is safe. I hope everybody has been absolutely splendiferously wonderful. Strangely cool day here in Georgia. Like so much that it is to the point of people wearing sweaters. My gosh. I mean, that's how cold it is here in Georgia today. I want to make sure that everybody sees the workings of our once was classroom. My goodness, look at how empty it is. Look at all the stuff is off the walls, all of our weekly gatherings, chairs and posters and stuff. It's such an interesting place. Look at that. Ooh, that's kind of cool. I could like doing like that. That's really cool. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. And thank you so much for coming back for our time as Sign of the Beaver folks goes. And so let's get started. It's 3:32 in the PM here. And I wanted to make sure that I reminded you that we want to remember that our notebook is super important. I'm not going to go into the explanation again because that's on chapters 1 and 2 in the beginning of that time. But I do want to remind you that you have your section for Sign of the Beaver. And I haven't been able to work on it because I've been really busy getting ready for the end of the school year. But then I turned the page and made sure that chapters 1 and 2 had a space. And I'm going to write a little bit, and then I'm going to move on to chapters 3 and 4. The other thing that I wanted to share with you is the idea of everything that I learned yesterday. I had some response from a couple kids who were like this, it's okay, it's all right. Now, the reason why you say it's all right, the story is all right, is because you're just getting to know the story. You're getting to know characters. You're getting to know the setting. You're getting to know the history, the whys, the whos, the whats. And that is work. It's like, remember, have you ever been like the first new kid at a school? Have you ever had to go to camp and not know anybody when you left and then showed up and then your parents said, goodbye, have a good day. And then you don't know anybody. And it takes a little while to kind of figure out the rules. It takes a little while to figure out what people are doing. It takes a little while to understand who you are in that situation. And so, Brian F., welcome. What we're talking about right now is the idea that we're getting to know where we are in the world, what the problem is, and who we are talking about. So let's break this down real quick. Dad and Matt left their home in Quincy, Massachusetts, and headed north into the Maine territory. Back then, Maine territory means it wasn't a state yet. So Massachusetts was a state, but Maine territory was not created yet. So they had bought land up there. So they had traveled up. Oh, how did the land get there? Because the Native American treaties, the Indian treaties with the American government gave up that land. So they moved up and there was supposedly peace. But I did hear a few things. One, we are in the Maine territory. So if I get my atlas out, my awesome atlas, you see, I have the United States of America, right? I have the United States of America. We've got Washington State in the Northwest. We have Southern California over here. We've got that peninsula, Florida right here. We have Georgia representing right about here. And then you go up this coast, because this is where all the colonists were in 1768 when the story comes. But this is Maine territory. The cool thing about having an atlas, a road atlas, a 2020 road atlas that's updated, is that they have all the states. So the cool thing that I wanted to show you as well is when you go to Maine, M-A-I-N-E, it's way tucked up in the very northeast part of our country, and it's a really, really beautiful place. The Appalachian Mountains end in there. There's lots of lakes. There are moose. It's a beautiful place. But so, sorry, I'm going A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, and Z. And then I found my Maine map. And Maine is not an overly big place. It's this whole area. It's this colored space. That's Maine. Look at all that space. It's ocean, 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 islands, islands, just like little pockets of islands and stuff like that all over the place. But if you take a look right about, where did I find it yesterday? Right about here. Right there. The Penobscot River runs from here down to here. So they were going to take the Penobscot River. That's what I heard in the story. And they were traveling somewhere here, and then it goes down into the ocean down here. So the Penobscot people, the tribe, would have been named the Penobscots before the river was named that. The reason why they named it the Penobscot River is because the Penobscot tribe was there. Do you get it? So this is really easy stuff as you put it together. So we know that we're in the state, what we would call Maine. We know that the year is 1768. We know that 12-year-old Matt is in a cabin. His dad has gone back to find his family, because that's what you did back then. There were no cars. There was no planes. There was no, well, there were ships, but they were sailing ships rather than motorized ships. So he literally was going across the space. There was no phones, no cell phones, no video games, those kinds of things. It was just life out in the middle of the frontier. And now our question is, what's going to happen? The last thing I want to say before we go. Do you remember at the very end that Matt was beginning to feel confidence in the silence? And then somebody unexpected arrived. So I'm going to finish with that on chapter 2, and then we're going to get into this. So you've got all the pieces of the puzzle, but the problem hasn't quite been shared, except for the fact that he's alone. So at the end of chapter 2, it said this. So he was not so quick-witted as he should have been when unexpectedly someone arrived. Chapter 3. He, being Matt, he was sitting on the flat stone that served as a doorstep, waiting for his supper to cook. The late sun slanted in long yellow bars across the clearing. The forest beyond was already in shadow. Matt was feeling well pleased with his day. That morning, he had shot a rabbit. He had skinned it carefully, stretching the fur against the cabin wall to dry. Stop. Who else do we know in our past was drying skins on a wall? Billy. Billy, from where the red fern grows, was stretching all of his coon skins. And then, remember, he was selling them with his dad. So I wonder if he's going to try to sell the rabbit skin, or if he's going to try to maybe make something out of it. Chunks of the rabbit meat were boiling now in the kettle over the fire, and the good smell came through the door and made his mouth water. In the dimness of the trees, a darker shadow moved. This time, it didn't disappear, but came steadily nearer. He could hear the crackle of twigs under heavy boots. Matt leapt to his feet. "Pa?" No answer. It wasn't his father, of course. It couldn't be. An Indian? Matt felt a curl of alarm against his backbone. He stood waiting, his muscles tense. The man who came tramping out of the trees was not an Indian. He was heavy-set, the fat bulging under a ragged blue army coat. His face was almost invisible behind a tangle of reddish whiskers. Halfway across the clearing, he stopped. "Howdy!" he called cheerfully. "Hello?" Matt answered uncertainly. Was this someone who ought to be greeted like a deacon? The stranger came closer, so that Matt could see the small blue eyes that glittered in the weather-hardened face. The man stood deliberately taking his time, looking over the cabin and the cornfield. "Nice place you got here." Matt said nothing. The man peered curiously over Matt's shoulder through the open door. He could easily see that the cabin was empty. "You all alone here?" Matt hesitated. "My father is away right now." "Be back soon, will he?" Matt was puzzled by his own unwillingness to answer. He ought to be glad to see anyone after all these days alone, but somehow, inside, he wasn't. He didn't quite know why he found himself lying. "Any time now," he said. "He went back to the river to get supplies. He might be back tonight. When I saw you coming, I thought it was him." "Guess I surprised you. Reckon you don't get much company way off here." "No, we don't," Matt answered. "Then your pappy wouldn't want you to turn away a visitor, would he?" the man asked. "Thought maybe you'd ask me to stay for supper. I got a whiff of it half a mile across." Matt remembered his manners. The man's easy grin was beginning to wipe away some of the doubt that he felt inside. "Of course," Matt said. "Come in, sir." The man snorted. "Ben's the name," he said. "You may have heard of me in the river town." "We didn't stay in the town very long," Matt answered. He hurried now to light a candle. The stranger stood inside the door, taking in every inch of the small room. "Your pappy knows how to build a good, tight house," he said. "You reckon on staying here for good?" "It's our land," Matt told him. In the candlelight, the room looked snug and homey, something to be proud of, showing off to a stranger. "My mother and sister are on their way up soon." "More folks coming all the time," the man said. "Time was you could tramp for a month and never see a chimney. Now the town is spreading out from the river in every which way." His eyes fell on the rifle hanging over the door. He let out a slow, admiring whistle and walked over to run his hand along the stock. "Mighty fine piece," he said. "Worth a passel of beaver." "My father wouldn't sell it," Matt said shortly. He was busying himself now to make the stranger welcome. He scooped out a good measure of flour, stirred in some water, patted the dough on a clean ash board, and propped it up in front of the fire to bake. He laid out 2 bowls on the table and 2 pewter spoons. He poured molasses into one pewter dish, and then he ladled the hot stew into the bowls. The way that the stew disappeared, the stranger couldn't have eaten a meal for a good long while. Matt took a very small share for himself. He pulled back his hand and watched the man snatch the last bit of corn cake. What does that say about him? The man snatched the last bit of corn cake at Matt's house. Now, is that rude? Is it polite? How do you think? He pulled back his hand and watched the man snatch the last bit of corn cake, sopping up the last of the molasses with it. Finally, Ben pushed back his stool, drew back his hand across his beard. "Oh, that was mighty tasty, son, mighty tasty. You wouldn't have a mite of tobacco now, would you?" "I'm sorry," Matt said. "My father doesn't have any tobacco." "Pity. Can't be helped, I suppose." In the easy silence that followed the dinner, Matt decided to ask a question of his own. "Are you traveling the river?" Ben snorted again. "Not likely. I'm keeping as fur off that river as I can till things quiet down." Matt waited. "Tell the truth, I got away from that town just in time. Weren't nothing they could prove, but they sure had it in for me. So I says, 'Ben,' I says, 'you've been planning on getting yourself some beaver pelts. Looks like now's the time to get moving. I aim to settle in with the Redskins a bit, maybe move more north.'" Pause. I need to ask you a couple questions as good readers. Listen to what Ben says. Matt had just asked, "Are you going to be using the river to get yourself someplace from here?" And the guy says, "Sorry, gotta do my dancing. Sorry." He said, "Tell the truth, I got away from that town just in time. Weren't nothing they could prove, but they sure had it in for me." Weren't nothing they could prove. Now, I need to ask you a real quick question as great readers. First, When you have to prove something, that either means you're guilty or you're innocent. But he said that he was going to leave until the town quieted down, until they had it out for him. And then he said, weren't nothing they could prove. So it means that they were accusing him of something. So instead, I'm not going down the river. I'm going to go try to find some time and live with redskins. What do you think a redskin is? I think it's relatively a derogatory remark about the type of person maybe an Indian might be or a Native American. So redskins is a negative term you don't want to really use these days for sure. But it sounds like Ben, I'm starting to build up some feeling about his character. One, he eats all the soup without asking if he can take the last bite. Second, he sops up all the molasses, which means he doesn't have a problem taking things at the last minute because he wants them. Third, he must have done something wrong in town because he's staying away from town for a little while. And so now I'm starting to get a bad feeling about Ben. Do you think that maybe that feeling on the inside of Matt's stomach probably might be an honest statement? You ever get that feeling in your stomach when you meet somebody, when you're really not quite sure? Listen to that. It's okay. It's okay to take time. You don't have to shake everybody's hand in this world. All right. So at least we have an idea of what this guy's like. You mean you're going to live with the Indians? Matt asked. Could do worse. I could bed down about anywheres. Certainly looked as though, invited or not, Ben was planning on bedding down right here in the cabin. He had eased himself off the stool and sprawled out on the floor of the cabin. His shoulders propped up against the wall. He pulled a dirty corncob pipe from his pocket and stared down at it ruefully. Ruefully. That was the word from yesterday. And remember, Matt was not feeling very good, and he had just asked if he had had some tobacco, and now he's got a corncob pipe, but he can't fill it with anything, so he's looking at it ruefully. Now my context clues are putting together. Pity, he said again. Meal like that needs baccy to set it right. He put the pipe away and shifted his heavy bulk against the wall. When I was not much more than your age, he drawled, well-fed and ready to talk, I'd spend the whole winter with the redskins. Hunt with them, trap, easy to pick up on their lingo. Still remember a deal of it. But this country ain't the same anymore. You got to go west, Ohio maybe, to get any decent trapping. The Indians still hunt here, don't they? Matt asked. The Indians is mostly cleared out of these parts, Ben told him. What wasn't killed off in the war got took with the sickness. A deal of them moved on to Canada. What's left makes a mighty poor living, game getting so scarce. Where do they live? Roundabout. Ben waved vaguely toward the forest. They make small camps for a while and then move on. The Penobscots stick like burrs, won't give up. They still hunt and trap. No way to stop them. Never got it through their heads that they still don't own this land. You never seen none of them? My father did once. Do they speak English? Enough to get what they want. They pick it up from the traders. What pelts they can scrape together, they can take into the towns. They can strike a sharp deal. You got to know how to handle them. Reason you ain't seen them, he went on. They got enough sense to stay clear of these parts when the bugs is bad. They move off the whole lot down the coast to get their year's mess of clams. Should be moving back about now. They'll stay the summer down at the water, and then they'll go off for the big hunts come fall. Them hunts, he remembers, ain't nothing like 'em nowadays. Bows and arrows was all that they had. Still use 'em some. If they can't lay hands on a gun, I got so's I was darn near close as any of 'em. Don't suppose I could hit a barn now with an arrow. Ben's voice drawled on and on, thickened with food and drowsiness. He told of the big moose hunts of his days with the Indians. He had fought in the recent wars against the French. Pause. That's probably the French and Indian War that you've heard about. You may have heard the French and Indian War was what began the road to the Revolution. He had fought in the recent wars against the French, which means he's an American colonist, and he despises them for stirring up the Indians against the main settlements. He seemed to have single-handedly shot down half the French army. Especially, he hated the Jesuit priests who had egged the Redskins on, and he had once been part of the expedition that broke into a chapel and smashed the popish idols. Once, he had been taken captive captive by the fierce Iroquois, who were set on putting him to torture. But he had been too smart for them and escaped in the night. Listening, Matt could make the man out. To hear the man talk, he had been as big as a hero as Jack the Giant Killer, but he didn't look the part. He had certainly fallen on hard times of late. No doubt about it, however. He could tell a good story, that Ben. The man's voice was trailing off, and he slumped lower and lower. Presently, he was sprawled flat on the floor and snoring. It was clear enough that he could bed down anywhere. At least he hadn't taken over Matt's bed. Matt moved about quietly, though he doubted anything could disturb Ben. He cleaned off the bowls with his twig brush. Then he banked the fire with ashes. Finally, he settled down on his hemlock mattress. But he couldn't sleep. He lay staring up at the log roof, even after the last flickers of firelight had died away and the cabin was darkness. He couldn't quiet his uneasy thoughts. Bragging about his adventures by the fire, Ben had seemed harmless. Just a fat, tired old man grateful for a good meal. To be honest, Matt had enjoyed his company. Now he began to worry. How long was Ben going to stay? He was sure to find out soon that Matt was living alone. When he did, would he decide it was more comfortable here than in an old Indian village? At the rate that he had wolfed down that supper, the flour and molasses wouldn't hold out for long. Would he expect Matt to go on providing meals and waiting on him? These are all good questions on Matt's part. And why had he left that town on the river in such a hurry? Was there really some charge against him? Was he dangerous? Perhaps a murderer? At that thought, Matt sat up in his pine bed. He'd be sensible to stay awake and on guard. He'd half a mind to fetch his own fetch down his father's rifle and keep it right near at hand. Then he felt ashamed. What would his father say about begrudging a stranger a meal and a night's of rest? All the same, he was determined not to shut his eyes that night. He kept them open for a very long time, but suddenly he jerked out of a deep sleep and saw that daylight was streaming across the cabin floor. The cabin door was open, and Ben was gone. Perhaps he had stepped just outside. Matt stumbled to the door, no sign of the stranger. Relief flooded over him. All that worrying, and the man had never intended to stay. Perhaps he had actually believed the lie that his father was returning that day. Then, once again, Matt felt stupid. He must have made it only too plain that Ben was not welcome. Would Pa say that he had done wrong? Still, it was too early to be sure. At any moment, Ben might appear hungry for breakfast. He had better stir up some fresh corn cake. It was then that he noticed his father's rifle was not hanging on the door. In a panic, he searched the cabin, his own bed, the corner shelves, under the table and the stools. He rushed back to the door and onto the edge of the forest. It was no use. No way of telling which way Ben had taken it or how long he had been gone while Matt slept. Ben was gone, and so was the rifle. He should have kept it in his hands, as his hunch had warned him. He could see now that a man He could see now that the man had his mind set on stealing that gun from the moment he laid his eyes. But even if Matt had it in his hands, could he have held out against the burly arms of Ben? And to keep his gun, could he actually have shot a man, even a criminal? It was only later, when his rage began to die down, that he felt a prickle of fear. Now he had no rifle. Now he had no protection. Now he had no way to get meat. Sick with anger, he sat staring at his row of notched sticks. It would be a month at least before his father returned. A month of nothing to eat but fish. And what would his father say about losing the gun? Chapter 4. It was hard to be deprived of the hunting. Now, whenever he went into the forest, the squirrels and the rabbits frisked about boldly, knowing perfectly well that Matt had no gun in his hands. You get that? So he truly thinks that the animals are literally running around and making fun of him. Once he was certain that he could have had a good shot at a deer. Instead, he went fishing, and he knew he ought to be grateful for the creek and the pond that they could provide all the food that he would need, even though fish didn't seem to stick to his ribs like a good meat stew. Here and there on a sunny spot, he discovered a patch of blueberries. Gradually, his spirits began to rise. The July weather was perfect. The flies and mosquitoes were less bothersome. He began to count the days ahead instead of the ones that he had notched. 2 or 3 more sticks, and his family would be here. The corn was growing taller. The little hard green pumpkins were rounding out. He could wait a little longer. Pause. I love how this author, Elizabeth George Spear, gives us the movement of time with the growth of the plants, like the pumpkins rounding out, the corn growing higher. If you've ever seen corn growing in a field, it starts out very short. And then you're supposed to be about knee high by the 4th of July. That's one of the rhymes that the farmers up in Minnesota used to say. But so the corn is starting to grow. What were some other clues that our year is moving on? The mosquitoes weren't as bad because it's not as wet. It doesn't rain as much. And the blueberries. Blueberries grow in the springtime, in the late springtime. They're coming up right about now. And so the blueberries are just starting to come fresh. I dare you to go over to the grocery store next time you're over there with your family. Go look in the produce department. I'll bet you $1 million you can get blueberries pretty cheap right now. Perhaps Matt even became a mite bit careless. He had been fishing all one afternoon. A good clear day, the water still nippy on his ankles, the sun warm on his bare head. He had followed a creek a long way and had a lucky catch. He came whistling out of the woods, swinging 4 speckled trout. He quieted down when all of a sudden, when he heard a cracking in the underbrush close by. Then he stopped short at the side of the cabin. The door was swinging open at a crazy angle, one hinge broken. Across the door still, some white stuff dribbled like spilled flour. With a shout, he dropped the fish and ran. It was flour, tracked all over the cabin floor. The sack ripped open and dragged across the room. The cabin was in shambles. The stools overturned. The shelf swept bare. The precious molasses keg upside down on the floor and completely empty. Ben must have come back. For a moment, hot sparks of anger drove every sensible thought out of his head. Then he knew it couldn't have been Ben. Ben was too fond of food to waste it. Indians? No, it wasn't possible any human would scatter food about like this. With a sinking heart, he realized what must have happened. He remembered that the thrashing in the underbrush, it had to be a bear. Somehow, he had neglected to bar the door securely. Well, the damage was done now, and the bear would be half a mile away. Helpless with fury at his own carelessness, he stood for some time in the middle of the cabin, unable to pull his wits together. Then he went down on his hands and knees and carefully began to scrape up the traces of flour. After a time, he gave up. The best he had managed to salvage was 2 handfuls of gritty, unappetizing meal. Even though he took the good pewter spoon and dug into the hollows of the dirt floor. After a long time, he felt hungry enough to remember the fish. Half-heartedly, he went back out, picked them up, and brought them back to clean them. He blew up the fire and roasted those small fish. He found a few grains of salt left in the tin to sprinkle on them. He would have to make the best of it. He wouldn't starve as long as he had fish. But tomorrow, he would not even have salt. So Matt, out of his own ignorance, got too cocky. I think this is the second time we've heard him get a little cocky. Remember, he was a little nervous about the silence, but then he started feeling comfortable. And as soon as he felt comfortable, then all of a sudden Ben showed up. Then he has feelings, and he's mixed between how he should feel. Should I trust this guy? Should I not trust this guy? What would my dad do? What would my mom want me to do? How should I act in this moment? I've been told to be kind, but at least this is a stranger, and now I'm 12 years old and I'm stuck in this house. What am I going to do? Next morning, all of a sudden, his rifle's gone. So days pass. He starts understanding that he's going to have to go fishing. And then all of a sudden, he takes this time and he goes out and has a really good fishing day. He's coming back, and what is he doing? He's whistling. So all of a sudden, he's starting to get super relaxed. Weird. And then, after he gets super relaxed, what happens? He comes back, and all of a sudden, the door to his cabin that he forgot to lock got broken into by a bear who has now eaten all of his flour, who has now eaten all of his salt, who has sucked on all the molasses, which is kind of a sweetener, kind of like honey, but different. It's like tree honey. That's all gone. And now he's got a little bit of fishing line, so he's not going to starve, but he does not have very much entertainment. Give me a second. Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, so now we are on to our last chapter for today. We're doing grades 3. Sorry, it's 4 o'clock here at time, and this is chapter 5. Chapter 5, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our last chapter at this point. Day after day, boy, things are getting long. He kept remembering a bee tree. Bee tree, spelled Beetree. A bee tree. He and his father had discovered it weeks ago. High in a tree at the swampy edge of the pond, they had called Loon Pond. The bees were buzzing in and out of an old woodpecker hole. Matt had thought that they were wild bees, but his father said no. There were no bees at all in all of America until the colonists brought them from England. This swarm must have escaped from one of the river towns. Bees were better left alone, Pa said. 2 things. 1, did you know that bees did not exist in America until European colonists brought them over? Do you believe that? We need to do some double checking of that. 2nd, Dad warns him, bees should be left alone. But what has Matt lost? He's lost all of his flavor from his salt, lost all of his molasses. So all he's eating is basically dull, boring food. Stuff that's going to keep him alive, but it's not going to be very tasty. And now he's starting to think of a bee tree. He felt he could scarcely endure another meal of plain fish. He was hungry for a bit of something tasty. Knowing so well his fondness for molasses, his mother had persuaded them to carry that little keg of molasses all the way to Maine, when his father would have rather gone without it. She would have smiled to see him running his finger round and around the empty keg like a child and licking off the last drop the bear had missed. Now he couldn't stop thinking about that honey in the bee tree. It would be worth a sting or 2 just to have a taste of it. Pause. Everything that I know about a situation like this says, I am not going to like how this story ends. It would be worth a sting or 2 just to get a taste of that honey. There couldn't be much danger in going up that tree and taking just a cupful perhaps, that the bees would never miss. One morning, he made up his mind to try it, come what might. It was an easy tree to climb, with branches as neatly placed as the rungs of a ladder. The bees did not seem to notice as he pulled himself higher and higher into the tree. Even when his head was on a level with the hole, they flew lazily in and out, not paying him any mind. The hole was small, not big enough for his hand, and the spoon he had brought with him. Peering in, he could just glimpse far enough inside, the golden mass of honeycomb. The bark all around the hole was rotted and crumbling away. Cautiously, he put his finger on the edge and gave a slight tug. A good-sized piece of bark broke off right into his hand. With that came the bees. With a furious buzzing, they came pouring from the broken hole. The humming grew to a roar like a great wind. Matt felt a sharp pain on his neck, then another, and another. And another. The angry creatures swarmed along his hands and bare arms, in his hair, on his face. How he got down out of that tree, he never remembered. Water. If he could reach water, he could escape them. Bellowing and waving his arms, he plunged toward the pond. The bees were all around him. He could not see through the whirling cloud of them. He could not see through the whirling cloud of them. The boggy ground sucked at his feet. He pulled 1 foot clear out of his boot, went stumbling over sharp roots to the water's edge, and flung himself forward. His foot caught in a fallen branch, and he wrenched it clear. Dazed with pain, he sank down into the icy shelter of the water. He came up choking. Just above the water, the angry bees continued circling. Twice more, he ducked his head and held it down until his lungs were bursting. He tried to swim in and out into the pond, but his feet were tangled in dragging weeds. When he tried to jerk them free, a fierce pain ran up his leg and went under again, thrashing his arms wildly. Then something lifted him out of the water. His head came up from the water, and he gulped air into his aching lungs. He felt strong arms around him. Half conscious, he dreamed that his father was carrying him back, and he did not wonder how this could be. Presently, he knew he was lying on dry ground. Though his eyelids were swollen almost shut, he could see two figures bending over him. Unreal, half-naked figures with dark faces. Then, as his wits began to return to him, he saw that they were Indians, an old man and a boy. The man's hands were reaching for his throat, and in panic, Matt tried to jerk away. "Not move," a deep voice ordered. "Bee needles have poison, must get out." Matt was too weak to fight. He couldn't even lift his head. Now that he was out of the cold water, his skin seemed to be on fire from head to toe. Yet he could not stop shivering. He had to lie helpless while the man's hands moved over his face and neck and body. Gradually, he realized that they were gentle hands, probing and rubbing at one tender spot after another. His panic began to die away. He could still not think clearly. Things seemed to be keep fading before he could quite grasp them. He could not protest when the man lifted him again and carried him like a baby. It did not seem to matter where they were taking him, but shortly he found himself lying on his own bed in his own cabin. He was alone. The Indians had gone. He lay, too tired and sore to figure out how he came to be there, knowing only that the nightmare of whirling bees and choking water was past and that he was safe. Some time passed. Then once again the Indian was bending over him, holding a wooden spoon against his lips. He swallowed in spite of himself, even when he found it was not food, but some bitter medicine, some bitter tasting medicine. Matt was left alone again, and presently he slept. Sometimes we think we know what we need. Sometimes we think that we can't take one more day of what we are dealing with right now because it just is unbearable. His unbearability is the idea that he can't stand not having something salty or something sweet in his mouth, and just eating isn't enough. Have you ever done that before? You ever been ungrateful when there's been food on your table? Me too. You know, one of the things that I think a lot about is that I think a lot about this Matt kid. Is he doing the best he can? He is. You know, losing your rifle is not easy. Losing your flour and your molasses and your salt to a bear who breaks into your cabin, it's not your fault, but it does make life hard. And so, as we begin this new book on its second day, it's Wednesday, we've got 2 more days of reading this week. I will tell you that this has probably gotten you a little bit more excited because you probably are connecting to Matt. Matt needs some connection. Matt needs sweetness. Matt needs connection. But when he decided to go and find his sweetness, he got himself into a situation that he couldn't get himself out of. And who came to his rescue? There are 2 Native Americans. What do we know about them right now? There's an old man and a boy. Now, boy doesn't give us very much to work from. But what we do know is that we know enough about them to say that, 1, they were obviously close enough to see that he was being attacked by bees. And that's interesting. Were they watching him? Were they following him? 2, did they trap him and try to hurt him? Not at all. They tried to help him. Then they brought him back to his own cabin. Does that make you a little bit weird? They obviously know where he lives because he wasn't in charge of moving it, and he certainly wasn't giving directions. Then he was left alone, and everything was kept at his cabin, so the Native Americans haven't stolen anything yet. The other thing that I think a lot about is the last piece, the whole part about the idea that they brought back medicine. So they know how to deal with bees because they know their land so well. I'm hoping that maybe tomorrow when we start reading, we'll meet these characters. But right now, all I know is that they are kinder than the man Ben that we met earlier. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is where we end. We start chapter 6 of Sign of the Beaver by Elizabeth George Spear tomorrow. I can't thank you enough for being here. Thank you so very much for your consistency. To my 5th graders, this may be the last time you see this classroom as it is, because I'm probably not going to be doing this work here anymore. So, without further ado, I want to tell you how much I love you, how grateful I am that you participate with our reading, and I hope beyond hope that you can forgive me. I promise that we're going to stick it close to about 30 to 35 minutes from now on. I love you. Have a great afternoon. Enjoy your day. Enjoy your life. It's the only one you've got. So take your opportunity as it comes and appreciate it for every chance you have. I hope you don't get stung by any bees. But without further ado, I love you. Now, get out of here. Have a great day.